Hello, I am Dr. Brandon Simonson of Boston University, and my presentation today is titled Divine Names and Intercultural Melding in the Imperial Aramaic Text Corpus. The use of Aramaic as an administrative lingua franca during the Persian period, from 539 to 332 BCE, resulted in an abundance of extant textual evidence documenting intercultural contact between the Persians and the populations they conquered. This evidence of cross-cultural interaction is especially apparent in the proliferation of diverse divine names. In my presentation today, I explore the appearance of divine names and epithets in the Imperial Aramaic text corpus, arguing that the invocation of these divine names can illustrate intentionally integrative acts of melding between different cultural groups living in the same locality. Three specific qualitative exemplars highlight intercultural melding: a lapidary inscription from Cappadocia, a papyrus from Elephantine Island in Egypt, and graffiti near Aswan, Egypt. These examples also illustrate the persistent attempts by ruling Persians to gain the support of local populations. Of greater Imperial Aramaic text corpus that includes the papyri, lapidary inscriptions, and terracotta tablets composed during this period, this study explores 83 texts containing 250 epithets. In analyzing these texts, this paper adopts the approach of Bonnet et al., which reads divine names and their accompanying epithets as descriptive onomastic sequences. Following Smith, this paper argues that the multiple divine names and epithets in these multicultural texts shed light on how different cultural groups interacted with one another. This study has greater importance for those interested in names as evidence of cross-cultural contact, the imperial proliferation of divine names, and the role of divine epithets as onomastic sequences. Recently, I have been studying Aramaic divine names and personal names from the Imperial Aramaic text corpus while I have been a visiting researcher for the Mapping Ancient Polytheisms project, a European Research Council advanced grant project led by Corinne Bonnet at Université Toulouse-Jean Jaurès. The main investigation of the project is to research how ancient people, using variable appellatives in variable combinations, conceived and shaped complex and fluid divine powers. In order to understand human perception of the divine, we read onomastic sequences, defined as combinations of various types of divine names or elements, nouns, epithets, titles, sentences, etc., some of which being specific and others being shared by different gods and goddesses. By targeting one or several relevant divine interlocutors, these onomastic elements play a strategic role in ritual communication in a given ritual context. The project embraces all the divine epithets as a language giving access to the cartography of the divine, to its modes of representation and declension, as well as to the communication strategies between humankind and gods. The product of this project is a comprehensive and open access database of all divine onomastic sequences in inscriptions and papyri, which you can find by navigating to the website and the QR code listed on this slide. Most of the data is accessible, but many of the Imperial Aramaic documents that I have entered into the database and recount in this presentation are still being processed and are not yet accessible. The project covers a wide range of documents from the Greek and West Semitic worlds, and as of January 2022, there are a total of 12,171 attestations of divine names and epithets from a total of 9,855 sources. The Aramaic language served as a standard language of imperial administration throughout the first millennium before the Common Era, as it was notably used by Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian rulers as a language of administration and commerce. The delineations between Old Imperial and Middle Aramaic are Fitzmyer's dates, and they just serve as a rough chronological outline here. By the time of widespread Persian hegemony in Syro-Mesopotamia and Egypt, we find that most of the ethnic Aramean population is no longer present throughout the land, a product of assimilation that we might call Assyrianization. Instead, The nisba, or ethnonym, Kur Aramayu in Akkadian, more likely referred to the individual's ability to speak or to write in Aramaic than their ethnic identity. This is confirmed by the interchangeability of the nisbe, or ethnonyms, Aramean and Judean on the island of Elephantine in Egypt. For example, TAD B2.7, a gift of house contract, Messiah, son of Yadaniah, is noted to be an Aramean of Syene, of the detachment of Varyazata, but in TAD B2.3, Messiah, son of Yadaniah, is noted to be a Judean, a hereditary property holder in Elephantine the fortress. The terms Yehudi and Arami, Judean and Aramean, are used interchangeably, suggesting that anyone who spoke and wrote Aramaic could be considered an Arami or Aramean, though those who were employed or worshipped at the local temple of Yahu could be considered Yehudi. Individuals given Aramaic personal names during this time may have had names that reflect either family tradition or the standard conventional language of the administration at that time. Because Aramaic served as the standard language of empire, we call this dialect Imperial Aramaic or Reichsaramäische. Imperial Aramaic follows the Old Aramaic dialect and is largely similar in orthography. The most significant distinction between the Old and Imperial Aramaic dialects is their use. While Old Aramaic generally represents the ethnic Arameans that use this language and these texts, Imperial Aramaic was the language used by empires and during the time of empire. There are subsets of Imperial Aramaic, one of which is called Official Aramaic, as it was used by the Achaemenids from 538 until about 331 BCE, and the other is called Egyptian Aramaic, delineated specifically by the Aramaic documents from ancient Egypt. One might consider Egyptian Aramaic to fall under the umbrella of Official Aramaic, and subsequently Official Aramaic under the umbrella term Imperial Aramaic. Egyptian Aramaic, therefore, represents the developments of Aramaic during the Persian rule of Egypt and in direct communication with the local Demotic Egyptian language of the time. We see many Egyptian loanwords in the Egyptian Aramaic material and plenty of Egyptian personal names, so each of these three labels can serve a purpose in identifying one trajectory of Aramaic development from the others. Using the greatest umbrella term possible, I will refer to two parts of the Aramaic corpus today, the Imperial Aramaic corpus, that which we find throughout Syro-Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, and the Levant, and that which we find throughout Egypt. In order to compile my sources, I use two indexes. The first one is Dirk Schwiderski's Die alten Reichsaramäischen Inschriften, and one volume of that was released in 2004, and the other volume, with updates to the first, was released in 2008. The second index I used was the catalog of the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon Project, which was updated in 2019. Overall, the Imperial Aramaic text corpus is massive, but the texts themselves are relatively limited in scope. In many cases, an Imperial Aramaic text is nothing more than a commodity chit, or perhaps a personal name inscribed on a seal impression or a receipt of goods. There are a number of Babylonian bricks that contain Imperial Aramaic inscriptions, though only the bare minimum is transcribed from the Akkadian text to the Aramaic inscription. The Egyptian Aramaic corpus of texts is relatively abundant and includes a number of papyri and papyrus fragments from both Upper and Lower Egypt. Most notably, the Egyptian papyri are among those in this category, but we also see a massive text corpus in Saqqara, and other texts from Memphis, both of which are in Lower Egypt. In addition to Elephantine and Aswan in Upper Egypt, we find Imperial Aramaic texts in small communities all along the Nile River. Compared to the massive text archives from Elephantine, the Syro-Mesopotamian and Levantine corpus is relatively limited, likely due to the fact that preserving papyri was more difficult along this section of the Fertile Crescent than it was in Egypt. While papyri are scarce, inscriptions bearing the names and descriptions of deities are still present. After that brief introduction to the database, the Imperial Aramaic language, and the Imperial Aramaic text corpus, I will now turn to my primary research question. The Persian tactic of adopting locally prevailing traditions of conquered populations is well established. We see that locally prevailing law in the Persian province of Egypt is prevalent throughout that time. Rather than imposing Persian law on the conquered population, laws of the Sate dynasty are retained. One of the most famous examples of theological melding is also apparent in the document known as the Cyrus cylinder. This cylinder, pictured on the screen, is likely a dedicatory inscription, and it details the Persian king Cyrus's conquest of Babylon in theological terms and the local Babylonian language of Akkadian. The Persian king invokes the names of the Babylonian deities as saviors of the Babylonian people from the previous tyrant king Nabonidus. In this account, Persian king Cyrus is called by the Babylonian god Marduk to free the Babylonian people. Cyrus is using the Babylonian deity to foster loyalty amongst the Babylonian people. We find a similar account in the biblical text, in the books of Ezra and Chronicles. The Persian king Cyrus is called Mashiach, or Anointed One, by the god of the Judeans, leading them back to Judah from their exile in Babylon. The Persian king knew how to appropriate the traditions of other cultures and other religions, melding Persian and Babylonian cultures in a way to promote intercultural cohesion and loyalty to the new Persian king. The primary research question that I have, therefore, is this. When read as onomastic sequences, can divine names reflect these same intentionally integrative acts of intercultural melding? To answer this question, I return to the map database. Of the extant text corpus, 83 texts preserve 250 epithets. The most common epithets included divine name the god, master, queen, or lord of the heavens, divine name the god who is in Elephantine, or the location in question, and divine name the god. These Imperial Aramaic epithets primarily serve to identify the divine status of the entity in the onomastic sequence. The names of the gods identified in these onomastic sequences were even more diverse, where I found the Semitic gods such as Nabu, Shamash, Cherem-Bethel, and Bel, Egyptian gods, including Osiris, Atum, lord of Heliopolis, Khnum, Min, and Ptah, Persian gods, including Ahura Mazda and a few other variants, and of course, the God of ancient Israel, with the variant spellings Yah and Yahu. Now, in order to answer our research question, we must approach instances in the corpus where a personal name is mentioned alongside of or interacting with the divine name. When interacting with a personal name, epithets were generally culturally homogeneous. In this context, cultural homogeneity might best be described as an Egyptian personal name being paired with an epithet of an Egyptian deity. However, a not insignificant number of culturally heterogeneous pairings appear. In this context, a personal name of an individual of one cultural identity is paired with the deity of another cultural identity. This second point is precisely where we can find intercultural melding. At this point in the presentation, I would like to share 3 instances of possible intercultural melding as evidenced by onomastic research. 2 of which feature culturally heterogeneous pairs of personal names and divine epithets, and 1 a brief narrative of 2 deities directly interacting with one another. On the left-hand side of the screen, you will find the first example, a Proskynema Graffiti on the Horus Stela of Senusert I at Wadi el-Hudi near Aswan, Egypt. The original text dates to 1971 to 1926 BCE, but the Vandal made his emendation nearly 1,500 years later at roughly 471 BCE. And this Vandal is an individual with a Persian name. This inscription reads, "Blessed be Artaxerxes, the son of Rama, before Shamash, the great god." This is an instance of an individual with a Persian name and patronym in an act of obeisance to the Semitic solar deity Shamash, all of which is written in Aramaic on an Old Kingdom Egyptian inscription in the southernmost part of Egypt. This is multiculturalism in a very real Persian period sense. The second example comes from a papyrus from a Judean community living on the island of Elephantine near Aswan, Egypt. This papyrus is a legal contract dating to the year 440 BCE. In it, we find a familiar woman named Miftachia, who appears in several other extant documents from this time. She is offered proof of withdrawal made by an Egyptian man named Peu, son of Pakhoi, a builder in Syene. The man shall no longer hold any claim over the goods mentioned in this or other contracts held by Miftachia, so she is free and clear to own this property. Despite all of the fascinating socioeconomic data present in this contract, we also find a fascinating personal name and epithet pairing. Miftachia, daughter of Maaseiah, son of Yedaniah, an Aramean of Syene, swears an oath about these goods to Sati, the goddess. In these legal documents, an oath is always sworn to the swearer's deity. If Miftachia is swearing an oath to Sati, we know that Sati is her goddess. What's striking here is finding a woman with a Hebrew name and a Hebrew patronymic identified as an Aramean swearing to an Egyptian goddess in southern Egypt. We know that Elephantine had a temple dedicated to the ancient Israelite deity known as Yahu in Persian Egypt, so choosing to swear an oath to an Egyptian goddess Sati is clearly a case of intercultural melding. The third example is a 4th century BCE stone stela from Arabson in Cappadocia, Turkey. From the image on this slide, you can see that transcribing the lapidary Aramaic text was a real challenge. There were a couple of challenging divine names listed in the text. I could quite easily read Bel, which is the Semitic deity, well known throughout the Levant, but I also saw what must have been some sort of Persian name with Mazda, a common Persian divine name, in it. The context of this text is in some way related to a divine marriage. My translation reads, Danae Mazda Yaznish, the queen, the sister, and the wife of Bel, thus says, I am the wife of Bel the king. Then Bel says to Danae Mazda Yaznish, You, my sister, are more wise and beautiful than all the gods. Therefore I have been joined to you, my wife. There are some relatively interesting relationships represented in this text. First, you see that a goddess named Danae Mazda Yaznish is simultaneously the queen, the sister, and the wife of another deity. Danae Mazda Yaznish is the Persian name that I mentioned, and you will notice that the king, the brother, and the husband of this Persian deity is the Semitic deity Bel. Then we find Danae Mazda Yaznish proclaiming that she is the wife of Bel the king. Like many other Imperial Aramaic documents from this time, the mere utterance of a phrase like this might represent the actual wedding itself. In many of the legal contracts at Elephantine, we find the act of divorce represented by a simple phrase, I hate my spouse, and voila, the divorce is enacted. By including that phrase, I am the wife of Bel the king, Danae Mazda Yaznish might be marrying Bel the king in this very text. We find Bel the king compliments Danae Mazda Yaznish by saying that she, his sister, is more wise and beautiful than all the gods. This inscription represents a divine marriage between the Semitic deity Bel and a Persian goddess, especially as the marriage language is similar to the legal language in the Imperial Aramaic marriage contracts. This interpretation also squares with what we know about Persian imperial expansion policy. In this paper, I explored the Imperial Aramaic corpus for heterogeneous personal names and divine epithet pairs that might help shed light on the process of cross-cultural contact. The rise of multicultural cities following the Neo-Assyrian period and the Neo-Babylonian periods give way to intercultural melding, which is apparent in the pairs of personal names with divine epithets. At Elephantine and Aswan, we find individuals of one cultural background demonstrating intercultural melding by either swearing to or offering obeisance to a deity from another culture. At Cappadocia, we have a very complex relationship between two gods from two different religious traditions, representing intentionally integrative acts of melding between different cultural groups living in the same locality. These qualitative examples illustrate how an onomastic approach, specifically regarding the relationship between personal names and epithets, might serve as a metric for evaluating cross-cultural contact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
I just wanted to make the observation that I made it in the chat, but it's interesting that the Rosetta Stone was written in 3 languages: ancient Greek, modern Greek, and Egyptian. And at the time, linguists knew how to read ancient Greek and modern Greek, but they didn't know much about Egyptian. They knew it was a bunch of pictures, and they didn't know if it was pictures or an alphabet or what. And then they saw some cartouches, which were some special indications of the names of kings and queens. So then if you take a cartouche, like the cartouche for Cleopatra, then you could see what the character was for the K, and the lion was a Leo, and so you have K, L, E, O, P, A, T, R, R, A. And so that gave you a head start on deciphering the rest of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Later on, during the German war, they had the Enigma machine, and they had the same problem. They were able, they get these code solvers to try to solve the Enigma machine. And they were always too late after the things had already happened. But then they realized that every time they sent out a message, they ended the message with Heil Hitler. And Heil Hitler gave them a start on deciphering, because then they knew what the characters were for H, I, O, H, it, O, Okay, so that gave them a head start. Then there came a problem, because then if you were deciphering the messages and the message says, go sink this ship, you had to make a decision whether you were going to not let them sink the ship and therefore reveal that you knew the code, or let them sink the ship so you could have the code so they wouldn't sink a bigger ship. I just wanted to say that. Sorry about that.
Oh no, thanks, Don. I think that's fascinating insight. Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that it was ancient Greek, the Middle Egyptian, and Demotic Egyptian was the third one. Demotic Egyptian being the sort of like the cursive version of the more traditional hieroglyphic language that we knew, which itself is even more undecipherable. It changes by the scribe, but yeah, that's fascinating insight on how that Enigma machine was deciphered as well. Thank you so much.
There's another comment I'd like to make, and that is about Darius. When he was writing in Rismilchat Mihi, which is the nail writing, and he would write these things telling about how many people he killed and all this kind of stuff. But that he was writing in nail writing. I just thought that was just an interesting fact. It has nothing to do with onomastics, except that Darius is very important.
Oh, definitely, yes. And especially as we usually refer to that era, that part of the Persian period, as when local law was codified, the codification of local laws, and really how the Persian Empire was able to maintain its borders. I mean, we're talking from Upper Egypt all the way through Anatolia. And we looked at an inscription from Cappadocia and one from Elephantine, just far extremes. They were able to manage because of that locally prevailing law. Thank you again.
Brandon, your presentation was so dense, and I really appreciate the QR code because I was able to look at the database. Dense in a good way. But my question is, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about your research process, and like to what extent the things that you found were kind of already done, or what you had to do. Like, were the translations done? Were there primary or were there secondary sources existing that had already done some of this analysis? Or were you where did you come in to the process, just because it's so layered and rich?
Thanks for that question. A lot of it was completed already. Quite a bit of the material in the Imperial Aramaic corpus was first discovered in the 19th century, and of the Common Era, of course, and then was published in the early parts of the 20th century. We're constantly reinterpreting, retranscribing, and retranslating as more and more documents come to light. It's, I mean, in some collections of documents are very, very small, so we don't really have a full understanding of some of these languages grammar like we do for, say, like ancient Hebrew or some dialects of ancient Aramaic. So it's, for quite a few of these, like the lapidary inscription from Cappadocia, I retranscribed and retranslated. So my translation differs from the Editio Princeps and the later André Lemaire's transcription and translation that was much later. So it's a variety of that to sort of already transcribed and translated papyri. The papyri from Elephantine, for example, was translated in the early parts of the 20th century and then retranslated by Bezalel Porton in 1980, from pretty much 1986 to 1999, and those are the standard translations today. So some of those I would enter into the database sort of as is, because it's he's just sort of the expert in papyrology. So the short answer to your question is it's kind of a range. Some of them needed to be retranscribed and translated, and others were ready to go.
And did you come across any in which the translations were conflicting? Like maybe people didn't agree about how they should be translated and you had to do any kind of interpretive work or with that, or kind of resolve that?
Definitely. When it comes to the to what I put into the database itself, many of the texts that were transcribed in the early 20th century but don't have a translation yet would be my interpretation of the text. The one from Cappadocia that I mentioned today, I think, is one of the most interesting that I found this last year during that work, just because we're wondering about the identity of this goddess Danae Mazdiaznish, who very rarely appears, and then you have to transcribe the Aramaic into Old Persian and into Elamite to see what the parallels might be. So some interpretations of that text say that it's Bel marrying a human named Danae Mazdiaznish, not a deity, and others will say that it could be a goddess, but we just don't know yet.
I have a linguistic question, if it's okay. During the Persian Empire, was the language spoken during the Persian Empire related to Aramaic? Was it a Hamido-Semitic language or an Indo-European language? Because the language of Afghanistan and Iran, these are Indo-European languages, but the writing system is Arabic, of course, because they're Islam, and so they read the Quran. But what was the language of the Persian Empire?
That's a great question. The primary administrative language of the Persian Empire was Aramaic, and so the Persian kings, in their own contexts, would likely speak and write a version of Old Persian or Elamite, which were both cuneiform languages at that time, which would look like Akkadian or Sumerian, sort of written in the lines and wedges. The Aramaic was so widely spoken that the empires would adopt that as their sort of lingua franca. We see that starting in the sort of Neo-Assyrian period in the 8th century BCE, and then by the time of the Achaemenid dynasty, it's pretty much widespread. So all of these decrees that you'll see from like King Cyrus and later Artaxerxes, Darius, will be in Aramaic rather than in their own language, what you'd expect. Really quick, there's another, just like the Rosetta Stone, there's another inscription on the side of a wall, the Behistun inscription, which is how we
by
first...
Darius?
Yes, by by Darius, and it's how we first deciphered some of these the cuneiform languages, because it's written in Akkadian, Persian, and Old Persian and Elamite. So very similar to the way that the Rosetta Stone helped us understand Egyptian.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Chris in the chat says, fascinated by the way you blend onomastics with cultural theory in the context of religious multicultural. Great presentation. I agree. Such a great way to close out the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.